Welcome to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. My name is Carl Stitchen, and I'm the Director of IELTS. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to the Director's Series of Seminars, a monthly remote event on the Institute calendar. Thank you for joining us. It's my great pleasure to welcome remotely to the Institute Professor Michael Thompson. Michael is currently Professor of Health Law at both the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia, and at the University of Leeds in the UK. His research interests span the fields of health law, on which he's published extensively, including on children's rights and on legal and political theory. Amongst his publications, he has written on the legal regulation of reproduction, on non-therapeutic genital cutting, and on children's rights more generally. His work is informed by theories that center the body as a means of re-articulating the responsibilities of the state and the relationship between health and social justice more generally. Michael's paper today is entitled A Reparatory Account of Health Inequalities. He will speak for 40 to 50 minutes, and questions can be raised by our audience members in the Q&A function at any time. I will then attempt to moderate the questions in the discussion period. The seminar is scheduled for 90 minutes. Closed captioning should be available at the bottom of your screen if you need it. And without further, by way of introduction from me, I'd like to turn the floor over to Michael. Welcome, Michael.
Hello and good morning to everyone. It's 8 o'clock in the evening here in Sydney. And it's been a bright sunny day after many weeks of rain, so I'm in a good mood anyway, and I'm wide awake at this point. When Carl invited me to do this, sometime in the middle of last year, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to have a deadline for a new paper, and so decided I would do this topic. In the second half of last year, I started what is a reasonably new area for me, put it down in November and then picked it up at the end of last week to see where we'd got to and what I could do this week. At that point, I wish I'd agreed to do a paper that was more developed, but I think I've got enough to actually give you a good go at where I'm heading. I think I have all my building blocks. What I might be a little bit shaky about is actually the connections between them, but we'll see what you think by the end. I'm just going to share my screen and then we can get going. I've had some problems with this week. Okay, so far. The history of reparations for slavery predates the Slavery Abolition Act 1833. As early as the 1780s, there were petitions from previously enslaved people, and Quakers were paying compensation to men and women that they had freed from slavery. The earliest attempt at a national reparations solution was in the 1820s, when the British Parliament debated and rejected a proposal of reparations for Caribbean colonies to receive money for the enslavement of their peoples. A decade later, reparations were part of Lord Wilberforce's Act in 1833. They took the form, however, of 20 million, equivalent to 16 billion today, paid to slave owners for their economic loss. This sum, an estimated 40% of the national budget at the time, and I'll return to this figure at the end, was paid to slave owners on the basis of the productivity and perceived value of their shares, the slaves. The debt was so large that it took the British government until 2015 to finally repay that debt. This compensation, the original 20 million, was combined with what so-called apprenticeships that tied freed men and women to work unpaid for their former owners. These positions involved fixed weekly hours for 4 to 6 years. Modern Britain is founded upon and shaped by slave ownership. Catherine Hall and the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery, so next door to the Institute at UCL, have investigated the individuals and structures that have allowed the effects of slavery to endure through commercial, cultural, historical, physical, and political legacies. Part of the work has been to trace this compensation, the money received by slave owners for the loss of their human property. This money was dispersed across economic, political, and cultural activities, as well as in the colonization of other territories. Recipients included a number of high street banks, so Barclays and NatWest, as well as the Bank of England and the Bank of Scotland. The Church of England was also a beneficiary, with one of the largest applications for compensation made by the Reverend Henry Philpotts, who was the Bishop of Exeter. The legacies of British slavery have created a census which has now expanded to more than 61,000 individuals, and their legacies can be traced throughout Britain's modern history. This work to make visible again slave ownership attempts to prevent the erasure of Britain's historical and modern reliance on slavery, and sets a path for what Hall has described as reparatory history. Bringing slavery home means tracking all of the material traces, following the money and the people, making visible the legacies of slave ownership, excavating what has been suppressed and marginalized, reinscribing the slavery business in modern British history in an effort to reshape what is understood as the truth of what happened. Uncovering the contemporary legacies of wealth generated by slave ownership directs attention to the very different legacies experienced by the descendants of those who experienced enslavement. The ongoing poverty experienced by many Caribbean populations, for example, has its structural causes in slavery. As the Caribbean Community, or Caricom, 10-point plan for reparatory justice recognized in 2014, many European states grew rich at the expense of those regions whose human wealth was stolen from them. David Scott has pointed out the enduring nature of the harms wrought by slavery. He writes, Caribbean debt is the other side of European theft. The point is that this is not a story of a mere episode in a marginal history. It is the integrated story of the making of the modern world itself. In contrast to the immediate payment to slave owners, payments of such a scale that it would take the country nearly 2 centuries to repay, the question of reparation for the deprivations caused and entrenched by slavery has been less easily resolved. Indeed, reparations are still fiercely contested. Drawing on long-standing and developing evidence from social determinants of health research, this paper brings together reparatory justice and health justice. Social determinants of health research has long linked social disadvantage to poor health and other outcomes. As the World Health Organization's Commission on the Social Determinants of Health noted in 2008, the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, and the inequities in power, money, and resources are what determines health and health inequalities. This creates a health gradient whereby health outcomes, to quote Scott Burris, line up on a steady slope from the have-leasts to the have-mosts. Importantly, this body of research highlights how investment in social determinants, addressing the conditions and qualities of life, promotes greater health and social justice. In addressing health inequalities in the context of slavery and its legacies of discrimination and disadvantage, this paper provides a reparatory account where we explore and understand the past in order to address the ways in which injustices may be acknowledged and put right. At the same time, the paper highlights the wider ethno-racialized nature of health inequalities and the need for these to be addressed regardless of reparatory arguments. This is both a strategic recognition of objections to reparatory claims and a commitment to health justice as essential for social justice. My reparatory account of race and health inequalities starts by providing a very brief history of reparations, acknowledging really that this is in general a history of failure. The argument then moves to look at how reparations have become to be articulated differently, with the debate moving from a focus on the payment of money and compensation to a broader reparatory politics. Social Determinants of Health research that links disadvantage to poor health outcomes is then introduced and the colour of health acknowledged. And the final section considers the politics of repair and the legal obligations that exist to address health inequalities. Reparation campaigns have emerged in a variety of contexts including slavery, mistreatment of people with disabilities, land rights, wage control, genocide, sexual enslavement, racist massacres, police brutality, and acts of war. It's in the last of these contexts, war reparations, where notable successes lie, and we should also acknowledge successes in some post-colonial contexts. Nevertheless, these are exceptional, and while campaigns for reparations are frequently launched, they have been largely unsuccessful, and this is particularly the case with reparations for slavery. In the UK, the attitude of governments towards the question of reparations can be characterised as dismissive. As already noted, the earliest example of an attempt at a national campaign was in the 1820s. The UK also debated and rejected various calls for reparations that formed part of the wave of independence campaigns from former colonies that marked the middle of the 20th century. The United States has a similar long history of failed claims. This started in 1865, when former slaves were initially promised 40 acres of land and a mule. However, following the assassination of President Lincoln, this scheme was swiftly overturned by Andrew Johnson within months of its commencement. The sum of unpaid promises under this reparation scheme is estimated to be now worth $1.3 trillion US. The question of reparations has resurfaced with renewed vigour in recent decades. John Torpey suggests that this has been a result in part of the faltering momentum of campaigns for racial and gender equality. In response, by the 1990s, the demand for reparative justice became, as Catherine Hall states, a global phenomenon. In the US, bills addressing reparations for slavery have been introduced annually since 1989. While these bills have been overwhelmingly opposed in the past, this has started to wane. And this has been buttressed more recently by the unrest and condemnation followed by a number of high-profile police killings, notably, of course, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd in 2020. The work of the Black Lives Matter movement has, of course, been instrumental and has been global. In July 2020, for example, Lambeth Council passed the first successful motion of its kind in the UK to formally demand reparations for slavery, calling on the UK government to establish a commission to study the impact of UK involvement in the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans and to make reparations. In March 2021, the Bristol Council voted to support the establishment of such a commission. While reparative action has not been forthcoming at national level, some initiatives can be identified. For instance, calls for the British government to pay reparations to Caribbean countries resurfaced and has circulated since 2002. While the payment of formal reparations has continually been rejected, UK investment in many Caribbean countries has increased, helping to improve infrastructure such as healthcare. Further, some organisations who received compensation for their historic ownership of slaves are now vowing to make significant payment to Black communities. Universities on both sides of the Atlantic have also made important interventions. While these initiatives are welcome, they fail to have the coordinated national approaches that we need. At the same time, such national approaches bring their own significant difficulties. The focus of most reparative claims are, of course, economic, and this raises concerns about the quantification, efficacy, and appropriateness of such claims. Looking first at the calculation of the value of reparations, it's argued that the sums owed can be extremely difficult to establish. Estimates for the US, for example, range from between $1 trillion to $19 trillion. In terms of efficacy, the sums owed may be considered both politically and practically impossible, reflecting the belief that a man confronted with an impossible debt will make no effort to pay it. Not only may the sum be impossible, but some also question the very nature of a financial settlement, noting the incommensurability between pain and compensation. There are further practical obstacles that are frequently identified. In the context of descendants of slaveries, these challenges include that the victims of the direct harm are dead, that the perpetrators are diffuse, and that some of the actual harms were legal at the time they were committed. Identified difficulties often have this legalistic hue, as if law is a natural and transhistorical determinant of the possible. Having said that, current legal rules do provide obstacles for those seeking reparations through the courts before any legislative action. As Johnston and Quirk state, in the absence of a clear-cut legal relationship between a set of identifiable plaintiffs and identifiable defendants, existing laws frequently have little to offer reparation campaigners. At the same time that these obstacles have been acknowledged and persist, the nature of reparation debates have shifted. In contemporary political philosophy, for instance, Forrester observes that reparations have been debated less against a backdrop of debate about slavery, equality, and racism, and more in terms of identity, cultural politics, global humanitarianism, transitional justice, and state power. Calls for reparations have moved to include more than financial compensation and an admission of past guilt. They now often seek admission of the trauma, discrimination, and disadvantage that has folded out from these past wrongs to create centuries of social injustice. This requires reparations to include compensatory, transitional, and indeed transformational purposes. These purposes form part of a broader notion of reparatory justice. A distinction is frequently made between reparations, generally denoting compensation, and reparation, the singular, which has come to mean repair and engages this broader reparatory politics directed at justice. It moves the debate beyond a focus on the payment of a compensatory sum and invokes the need for a broader response to the obligations that are owed. This follows in part from a more appropriate temporal frame, looking beyond an act to which compensation attaches to the wider context, history, and legacies of harm. Thus, it acknowledges the government policies and decades of indifference, for example, that followed the legal end of slavery that have directly produced ongoing racial disparities in wealth, health, and criminal justice. In terms of this temporal frame, it's also forward-looking, aiming to achieve cultural changes that diminish the likelihood these things will take place again. These arguments do not negate the need for financial compensation, but rather acknowledge the limitations of money and the need for other responses to address the enduring harms of slavery. They may also offer something of a pragmatic response to the important political realities of an impossible debt. Different approaches to reparatory justice have evolved. Kim provides an example of a very broad approach that includes more in the way of symbolic prospective reparations, pointing to a holistic notion of reparative action that encompasses ritualized apology, material restitution, political memorialization, and accurate historical education. Howard Hassman echoes this, stating that accurate acknowledgement would be the first step in reparations. Apology is a second step. Memorials and financial reparations then follow. Apology, memorialization, public education, and financial compensation are essential, yet they must be joined by interventions that address the material conditions of communities of color living with the legacies of slavery. This may be understood as transformative reparation. As Maria Saffron and Rodrigo Oprimi argue, transformative reparations conceive of reparations not only as a form of corrective justice that seeks to deal with the suffering caused by atrocities, but also as an opportunity to effect democratic transformation of societies. This transformation fundamentally seeks to overcome situations of inequality and exclusion. The Caricom 10-point plan that I've already mentioned provides an example of, again, this very broad and far-reaching proposal, which is both backward-looking and forward-looking. It seeks a full apology, development program for Indigenous peoples, repatriation possibilities, cultural institutions, attention to the public health crisis, illiteracy eradication, African knowledge programs, psychological rehabilitation, technological transfer, and debt cancellation. Whilst it's claimed that public appetite for reparations has improved, it's nonetheless likely to fall far short of the level needed for meaningful legislative action. In the context of sustained failures and the significant and multiple disadvantages experienced by many communities, it can be argued that a pragmatic approach is now an ethical obligation. The argument is not to ask for less, but to seek reparatory action that meaningfully addresses the material legacies of slavery in a way that is politically possible and has enduring outcomes. The proposition here is that while reparatory justice may provide direct compensation, simultaneously targeting social welfare provision may be more politically acceptable, securing the longer-term transformations that are required. The specific model argued for here directs attention not just to the racial wealth gap, but also to the health gap with which it correlates. This health gap is a social injustice arising in part from the disadvantages that slavery has caused and entrenched. In a recent contribution to the reparations debates, Matthew Evans and David Wilkins respond to the Caricom proposal and argue convincingly for a clearer and strategic differentiation between backward-looking compensatory and restitutionary claims and forward-looking redistributive and transformatory claims. In terms of the latter, Evans and Wilkins argue that such forward-looking claims that are often focused on development programs, so healthcare, education, housing, and so forth, may be regressive. They argue that framing claims to these fundamental socio-economic rights as necessary because of historic injustices is politically limited in three regards. First, it carries the danger that powerful actors can avoid responding to such claims as causal arguments fail, and they have often been seen to fail. Second, if claims are successful, it can limit action only to those who are seen to have suffered historic injustices, other than those who have entitlement to basic rights. Third, related to this, it can undermine more generally the independent obligations of states to realise the rights of present day and future people. This engages with criticism elsewhere that argues that reparation campaigns have in some instances replaced more radical and transformatory agendas. The bringing together of reparatory justice and health justice answers this important criticism. Here, health justice is promoted not just because of the need to address health inequalities that are the consequence of the deprivation caused and entrenched by slavery, and the ability to use health justice in reparatory politics in the strategic way I've suggested, but also and independently because health justice is an end in itself that acknowledges health as a right that implicates and engages other rights. As such, the argument mobilizes health inequalities both as part of reparatory justice and as a claim to independent rights and social justice. And it's this linking together, I think, of reparatory justice and health justice where I have quite a lot more work to convince people. Health justice acknowledges the special status of health, which is, to quote John Coggan, foundational to human well-being and social and political existence. Inequalities in health are therefore inequalities in opportunity and freedom and a social injustice. Understanding health in this way mandates that improving population-level health must be a primary function of the state. Nevertheless, as we all know, states often accept or promote situations that create or exacerbate health inequalities. As the World Health Organization's Commission on Social Determinants of Health highlighted, the unequal distribution of health-damaging experiences is not in any sense a natural phenomena, but is the result of a toxic combination of poor social policies and programs, unfair economic arrangements, and bad politics. Together, the structural determinants and conditions of daily life constitute the social determinants of health and are responsible for a major part of health inequalities between and within countries. In addressing social determinants, there have been a number of attempts to identify the relevant social institutions and structures. In Closing a Gap, the Commission organised determinants under two headings: the first, daily living conditions; the second, power, money and resources. Daily living conditions brings together healthy physical environments, fair employment and decent work, social protection and access to health care. Power, money and resources includes health equity as a goal, fair public financing, market responsibility, gender equity, political empowerment, and good political governance. As noted, inequalities in health are inequalities in freedom and should provoke deep concern. Yet inequalities in health also demand our attention as they highlight structural inequalities. As Michael Marmot writes, when a society is flourishing, health tends to flourish. When a society has large social and economic inequalities, it also has large inequalities in health. Health inequalities therefore highlight social fault lines of inequality, discrimination, and deprivation. These can derive from historically entrenched social injustices, including the enduring legacies of slavery. And this, of course, is a key point. Slavery and other historic injustices, such as the wider practices of colonialism, have led to enduring patterns of disadvantage for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic populations. And these have impacted on health outcomes across minority ethnic groups. Racism, for example, has been identified as a significant contributor to health disparities. As Evans and Wilkins note, racism was one of the significant legacies of transatlantic slavery, perhaps the most significant. Racism affects health from the cumulative experiences of interpersonal racism and discrimination through to structural racism. This has been documented widely. Here's an example from Public Health England. There is growing evidence that racism plays a role in the poorer physical and mental health of minority ethnic populations via direct personal experiences of racist victimization or discrimination, and via the fear or expectation that racism may be encountered. The pervasive experience of racism in day-to-day life also increases the likelihood of negative experiences and low satisfaction with health and other services. Racism also impacts indirectly on health via exclusionary processes operating within education, employment, and housing, so the social determinants of health. Notwithstanding this, race and racism has not been a central concern in social determinants of health research. Here, and as Ingleby notes, social determinants almost always turns out to mean socio-economic determinants, even when race is the focus. Even when race is the focus, this can quickly collapse to socioeconomic factors. As Public Health England illustrates with this alternative claim, it is the social and economic inequalities associated with ethnicity that are the major drivers of the large inequalities in health status. Morbidity and mortality within all ethnic groups is strongly patterned by socioeconomic positions. This is, of course, important, but it obscures the importance of race itself, as well as the need to address the causes of the causes. That is to say, it obscures the fact that certain ethnic minority groups are overrepresented in the lowest socioeconomic groups, and the need to understand why this is the case. Social stratification is intimately linked to ethnic diversity, and in particular, practices of large-scale immigration, oppression of indigenous groups by settlers, and slavery. In each instance, social inequalities are linked to the legacies of colonialism and racism. Cinzia Bailey, Justin Feldman, and Mary Bassett have recently argued that the multiple domains where structural racism affects health can all be characterized by three cardinal features. The harms are historically grounded, involve multiple institutions, and rely on racist cultural tropes. So these are the social, political, and historical causes of the causes of racialized health inequalities, and direct us to the legacy of chattel slavery, including persistent notions of racial hierarchy and white supremacy, and to return once more to Evans and Wilkins. The institutionalization of chattel slavery in the Americas contributed to the development and entrenchment of modern anti-Black racial prejudice. Legacies of this racism and the associated production of white privilege continue to shape life chances of individuals both within and outside the wider global economic legacies of transatlantic slavery. In other words, the racial hierarchies of chattel slavery still influence socioeconomic realities both within and between nations which were historically engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. Returning to the special status of health, health inequalities therefore continue the social injustices of slavery. This gives added weight to arguments that failure to meet rectificatory duties and the subsequent passage of time do not nullify the obligation to make reparation. As Daniel Butt has argued, failure to meet rectificatory obligations does not absolve colonial powers of their duties with the passage of time. Indeed, failure to rectify injustice counts as an act of injustice. The passage of time does not mean that a particular set of reparative obligations lapses. Further, failure to meet an initial obligation can compound harm, as starkly illustrated with generations of health inequalities. And this means that reparation in the form of a single compensatory payment becomes inadequate. As Butt continues, the disadvantage in question is unlikely to be resolved by a one-off payment. Instead, what is indicated is the need for an ongoing commitment on the part of the advantaged community to correct the distributive distortion caused by both the initial wrongdoing and the subsequent failure to fulfill rectificatory obligations. Having argued that health inequalities are part of the long shadow cast by slavery, the next section addresses health inequalities experienced by Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities in the UK. Findings across different populations are provided for three reasons. First, the contemporary experience of disadvantage and racism shared by different populations of colour and ethnicity have their roots in the broad and complex histories of colonialism, of which slavery was a part. Second, and following from this, the experience of disadvantage and health inequalities are deeply raced. Third, the argument regarding social determinants that's promoted here relate to universal provision, which would help to address the ethno-racialized social injustice of deprivation and health inequalities. This acknowledges the fact that it's deeply problematic for development provisions, and by implication, the realization of social and economic rights to be contingent upon the victimhood of the communities intended to benefit. So to return to look at some of the health inequalities in a bit more detail. If this analysis was to focus on the US, it would probably start by highlighting the blunt fact that life expectancy of African Americans is 4 years shorter than life of non-Hispanic whites. The headline figure is quite different and changing in the UK. And for both jurisdictions, the broader landscape of inequalities is complex and understanding is compromised by the limitations in the available data. Nevertheless, as the UK Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology stated, British, Asian and minority ethnic groups generally have worse health than the overall population, although some groups fare worse than others and patterns vary from one health condition to the next. So health inequalities exist between ethnic minority and white groups and between different ethnic minority groups. For instance, Gypsy or Irish traveller, Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities have the poorest health outcomes across a large range of indicators. More generally, however, in terms of these individual indicators, there's a high level of variance. So, for example, while rates of maternal mortality are generally low in the UK, poor outcomes are higher for mothers and babies from Black and Asian ethnic groups, and for women living in the most deprived areas in the country. Compared to white groups, the rate of women dying in the UK in 2016 to 18, during and up to 1 year after pregnancy, was more than 4 times higher in the Black group than in other groups. Ethnic minority groups also have a higher chance of being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes when compared to white groups and experience greater instances of complications. Obesity is another condition that's experienced by a significantly higher number of Black adults, and childhood obesity also has a higher prevalence among Black and Asian children. It's associated with high levels of deprivation and has a significant bearing on immediate and future health. Children in Asian and Black households are twice as likely to live in persistent low-income households than children in white households. Such deprivation is also a risk factor in infant mortality, which is experienced at higher levels in all ethnic minority groups. So data highlighting differential experiences of disease has drawn attention to the number of years of life led in good health, so-called healthy life expectancy or health span. Watkinson, Sutton and Turner examined health inequalities and their influence on quality of life for adults aged 55 years living in England. And they found evidence of widespread ethnic inequality in health-related quality of life. The study found that for almost all ethnic minority groups, health-related quality of life was worse compared to white British people, with the average health of 60-year-olds belonging to 5 groups, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Arab, and Gypsy or Irish travellers, similar to that of an average 80-year-old. The picture is therefore complex and understanding causation is difficult. It's suggested that experience of health inequalities are driven by an interplay of deprivation and environmental and physiological factors and health-related behaviours. The Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology concluded ethnic health inequalities result from many interlinking factors, of which the relative poverty is probably the most important. Public Health England, again, ethnic minority people reside disproportionately in areas of high deprivation with poor environmental conditions with concomitant negative impacts on health. While these observations are important, it again circumvents the causes of the causes. That is, the question of why these groups are overrepresented in the lowest income groups. In 2021, the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities released the independent report on health in the United Kingdom. Duplicating earlier findings, the Commission found that for several key health outcomes, including life expectancy, some ethnic minority groups have better outcomes than white populations. The existence of a mortality advantage for some groups belies the overall health disadvantage and complexity of the data. Importantly, and as the Commission noted, it also indicates that physiological differences are not the major driver of health inequalities that eventuate. Rather, such inequalities are caused by deprivation, geography, and differential exposure to key risk factors. 2 further points are important to note. Firstly, any mortality advantage is principally associated with first-generation migrants and decreases with subsequent generations. This is often explained by reference to the healthy migrant effect, whereby people who migrate tend to be in good health. The negative effects of assimilation in terms of deprivation and health-related behaviours are then seen in subsequent generations. And this puts into question the public health and the political significance of any initial mortality advantage. Second, COVID-19 has had a dramatic impact on ethnic minority mortality rates, reversing the mortality advantage that existed for some groups. COVID-19 has therefore, in some regards, simplified this complex picture in the worst possible way. The pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on ethnic minority communities to the extent that all ethnic minority groups now have a higher overall mortality than white populations. In this, COVID-19 has acutely highlighted how health inequalities are ultimately driven by unequal distribution of wider determinants of health, such as employment, income, housing, social networks, education, and access to green space. As Alicia Eli Yamin has noted, COVID-19 is in reality a social X-ray that illuminates the fragmentation and social inequalities within and between societies. The statistics detailing ethnic disparities and the impact of the virus is stark. And in the written paper, I go into much more detail. And here I'm just going to provide a snapshot with three statistics from the first year of the pandemic. Firstly, British, Asian and minority ethnic communities together make up 13% of the UK population, and yet accounted for 1/3 of those with the virus who were admitted to intensive care. South Asian and Black African populations had positive test rates approximately twice the times of the rates of white British. And in the early months of the pandemic, the rate of death for Black males was nearly 4 times greater than for white males, and the rate for Black females was nearly 3 times greater than for white females. As Yaya and her colleagues note, persistent health disparities have been well known for many decades, but often systematically ignored. COVID-19 exposes, once more, the racial fault lines that have been the norm in many countries' health systems and social and economic policies. It's been noted, and I certainly noted at the beginning, that the history of reparation campaigns is, in general, a history of failure. While some document a changing appetite to repair the injustices of the past, others caution that significant state-based responses remain unlikely. Wariness regarding the likelihood of securing state responses has generated warnings that energies expended on such campaign are misdirected. Johnson and Quirk. There is a strong likelihood that the recent upsurge of claims for historical restitution has attracted energies and resources that might have gone to other causes. If some claims for historical restitution are likely to have limited political prospects, then perhaps other forms of political argument might be more successful in achieving comparable or equivalent goals. Rhoda Howard Houseman makes a related argument. As she states, it is more realistic to promote Africans' economic human rights through institutional, political, legal, and economic reform than to urge either world redistribution of wealth or financial compensation to Africa for past injuries. These arguments foreground the need for political pragmatism in the face of entrenched lived inequalities. There is, however, a question of whether such discourses are necessary separate strategies or whether contemporary understandings of reparatory justice direct us to address the effects of historic injustices on contemporary human rights. And this is suggested by Torpe. Reparation politics, which takes its cue from the German response to the Holocaust, often have a backward-looking dimension. Yet more forward-looking types of reparations seek to harness the prevalence of human rights to political projects orientated both to coming to terms with brutal pasts and to equalize the imbalance between rich and poor. Linking reparatory justice and health justice is forward-looking and addressing the imbalances between rich and poor must include responding to health inequalities through investment in the social determinants of health. As Bailey, Feldman, and Bassett state, combating health inequalities will require policies that restructure the chances for a healthy life for people of colour, righting the wrongs of everyday life. The focus on health inequalities and the determinants also has the benefit of engaging existing legal obligations. So, for example, in domestic law, racialised health inequalities engage duties that exist under UK equality legislation. Public Health England. Effective action on ethnic health inequalities will help meet the legal duties on the Secretary of State for Health, NHS England, and clinical commissioning groups to have regard for the need to reduce health inequalities and to comply with the Equality Act 2010. There are also obligations in domestic and international law in the context of the right to health, particularly when read together with non-discrimination obligations. Like reparation campaigns, the right to health has had limited success. Yet it's possible that change may be leveraged by bringing reparatory justice and health justice together. This argument relies to an extent on the changing place of race in political discourse. Specifically, in the last 5 years, we've seen a sea change in the recognition of racism as a durable feature of society and of its high cost in Black lives. With this change comes growing recognition that racism has a structural basis and is embedded in long-standing social policy. This changing awareness has been further scaffolded by the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on populations of colour. These factors highlight states' involvement in the continuing racism and disadvantage that limits and prematurely ends the lives of people of colour. Importantly, this focus on the state also historicises the racism and disadvantage, locating these legacies in slavery and colonialism. This has created an increased appetite for reparatory politics, especially as the meaning of reparation has evolved. So, to return to where I started, and that is with the slave owners' compensation awarded under Lord Wilberforce's Act of 1833. You remember that the value of that compensation was 20 million, calculated to be 16 billion today. It's been suggested that this sum provides a basis for reparation today. However, it can be argued that a more appropriate place to start is with the fact that the settlement in 1833 was an estimated 40% of public expenditure. Using this figure recognises first the difference in population size that significantly diminishes the representative value of a purely inflation-adjusted figure. Second, the fact that the sum was invested by recipients generating significant enduring intergenerational wealth. And thirdly, that the impacts of slavery for both slavers and those who were enslaved have remained entrenched across growing generations. In 2021, the UK budget breached £1 trillion for the first time. 40% is, of course, 400 billion, a sum that could be used to improve the social determinants of health of the most disadvantaged people across housing, education, healthcare, access to green space, and so forth. For those who maintain that this is unaffordable, perhaps an impossible debt, they can be reminded that there was no rush to pay back the earlier compensation that now provides the model for this proposition. And I'll finish there.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for that. You characterized it at the beginning as very much preliminary work, but it seems to me a very polished paper. And thank you very much for that. And I invite our audience members to submit questions at any point in the Q&A function. But I have a few questions to get us started. And my first one is really to invite you to comment on your thoughts on the challenge of, because your paper covers a lot of different historical experiences, which are obviously related, but distinct. The experience of slavery, the experience of colonialism, the experience of conquest of First Nations peoples. And I'm wondering if that's a challenge in trying to look at these, and obviously health inequalities are relevant, highly relevant, as historical legacies of all three. But there may be different experiences, complexities. Is that a challenge when doing this kind of work?
Of course, you're totally correct. And this is, perhaps, your words were very kind at the beginning. Thank you, Carl. But this is, this is where the paper is very much a draft, I would say, in that I do have to navigate. My instinct is telling me that whilst these are potentially very different experiences, that there are commonalities within these in terms of experiences of, diverse experiences of suppression, and chattel slavery being the most extreme within that. But actually what I'm recognizing those differences, nevertheless recognizing that the enduring impacts share common themes. So there are experiences from these broad experiences of colonialism and colonial practices that do result in disadvantage for a large number of different ethnic populations. So yes, this is the draftiest part of the draft in terms of my thinking through and working out what I can legitimately pull together and whether my underpinning belief in the commonalities of current disadvantage and health inequalities is enough to carry those different experiences. It might well be that intuition is misplaced, or it's an intuition that's right, but I cannot work it through sufficiently to convince people. So,
yeah. But on the other hand, it might be that health provides the thread. Maybe health might even be a unique thread that provides a commonality. So I leave that with you as something that obviously you're thinking about. What always strikes me about the critiques of reparatory claims and accounts is, as you point out, the argument that quantification is difficult, and that the incommensurability of money for the loss. But I suppose the response is that's true in law, that's true in tort law, that's true in a lot of areas of law generally, and the law says, well, of course, many things are difficult, but that doesn't mean you don't try to, you don't compensate. So it just strikes me that this is always quite a bogus argument that's raised about the challenge of reparation, as you know, as a former tort lawyer, or maybe current tort lawyer.
I am currently a tort lawyer, an Australian tort lawyer. There are arguments that are there. The question of incommensurability has been raised historically by survivors of slavery, by ex-slaves, and it's a discourse that needs to be recognised. The question of quantifying the compensation, I think, is pretty bogus. I think we can always quantify. And I think that's why some people have found the 1833 sum attractive in some ways, because it sort of pins it on a moment where compensation was easily arrived at. And just as a side note, the sum arrived at by the government was 20 million. The slave owners claimed that the value of the 600,000 slaves in the Caribbean colonies was worth 47 million. And so the program of so-called apprenticeships was seen to provide that missing value. It was also a way of moving the slaves from formal slavery, the people from formal slavery, into indentured labor, really, one of many techniques that we used.
We have a question from your former colleague, Ruth Fletcher, who thanks you for a rich paper. Her question is about how, as academics and universities, we best bring reparative justice together with epistemic justice. How do we best adopt research, teaching, and engagement practices in the doing of health law at quote unquote at home, which foregrounds the contribution of the enslaved and their descendants to knowledge?
Nice to hear from you, Ruth, and thank you for attending, and thank you for the question. Yes, I think there have been a number of initiatives, particularly in transatlantic and other jurisdictions, to look at decolonizing the curriculum, how white is my curriculum, looking at other aspects, looking at issues of epistemic injustice and so forth, and the various subjects that we teach. Australia, for some reason, has less of that. On my experience is that we have less than that, although I have been pushing gently on some of these issues. But I think, it's been very important to see moves in this direction. again, and as an aside, I have a potential follow-up paper depending on whether I manage to pull off this paper on the specific role of education in reparatory politics, which covers some of these initiatives, but also moves on to look at, there's a lot within reparation from Catherine Hall and others that looks at the need for honest education, reparatory history, shared understandings of history, shared correct understandings of history, but also the role of education at every level in terms of a determinant of health. So I think, whilst Carl, I think that's very interesting, and I will pursue this idea of health that might find its way through these different experiences of colonialism and their impact. I think there's a paper that keeps hold of health in some regards that actually brings us through to the important place that education at every level has in reparatory politics.
I was, it was good to hear the analysis of COVID-19. I thought that was really very powerful part of the paper, and stark. I mean, the statistics are absolutely stark. I wondered also whether this could be linked to global vaccine politics as well. And really the paucity of arguments that are made in terms of the global justice arguments around vaccine distribution. It seems that so many of the arguments are simply framed in terms of a kind of quote unquote our own interests. To prevent variants emerging and infecting us, but there's very little, it seems to me, that's being discussed around the centrality of global justice in terms of the reason, the rationale for vaccine distribution globally to the global south, which could be linked, I think, also to reparatory accounts.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of points there. I think there are genuine calls for vaccine justice at a global level, and then I think these are perhaps sold at home as a way of ensuring our own safety. I think there is a pandering to self-interest in terms of the political discourse internally, and that works. That's because it is the way to reach people. And I think you're totally right. I think the impacts of slavery are still, of the transatlantic slave trade, are still structuring economic, political and social relations between these affected nations and beyond. In terms of the legacies of slavery and the experiences of slavery, both predominantly in the US, we see low levels of vaccine uptake among African American populations in some areas because of a distrust of medicine, who have been part of the scientific racism embedded and justified a lot of these issues. Ongoing racism was supported by the medical profession, by biomedical science and so forth. Huge levels of distrust that were generated at that point and in subsequent mistreatment through most of the last century. So that's a continuing legacy of slavery that's playing out in domestic vaccine policies. The same in Australia. There's been levels of dis-ease, of hesitancy among First Nation populations because of experiences of colonial rule and of the colonial legacy.
A question from another former colleague. Your past, Michael, just seems to be coming together here. This is from Mary Fox. Mary asks, are there particular case studies or groups that you think might be especially productive to focus on in a UK context? as a way of holding on to the commonalities of disadvantage, but working through details. And her example, or Irish traveler disadvantage, seems interesting.
I'm going to take that one as a tip for how to bring it all together. I'm not sure I have an answer now. I would like to do more work in the paper, and I have done more work in the paper, and I've done work elsewhere on COVID-19 and the impacts on different ethnic groups. I mean, there are plenty of awful statistics and analysis of different groups, so there might be something there. But yeah, thank you. I'll give that some thought.
It seems to be a theme of somehow working through commonality and difference. It seems to be a common theme. I mean, the other thing that I thought of is around health and care work and the kind of racialization, the colonial legacies of care work. Certainly in the global north, the north-south way that plays out, the extent to which our health and care, the provision of health and care work in the north is supplied so often by those from the south and from descendants of colonized peoples, and that seems to be another legacy, which also connects to health inequalities. Just as slavery was about the provision of care for certainly white children, and indeed servants, there is this ongoing care work that's provided on a racial basis.
Yeah, again, a number of points in that. Yeah, one of perhaps, to bring that together with Mary's question or suggestion, is to look at sort of employment within health sectors. For example, Black African women provide 20%, or 20% of Black African women are employed in health and social care roles, where they were, of course, or have experienced higher levels of exposure to the virus, and then also have used public transport to get to work, also suffer higher levels of comorbidity. So the whole experience of infection and then the way that the infection has played out has been increased because of the number of interlinking factors there. But clearly, the issue of care, healthcare, social care, the continuing legacy of slavery is there, and that's an interesting angle that I could take. I mean, just as a follow-up that could sound flippant, and I hope it doesn't, but a line that was going around was that COVID was about white middle-class people staying at home whilst people of colour brought them things. And that's certainly another aspect of that sort of so-called social care.
And it didn't sound flippant. I thought it sounded sadly too true. I thought also the forward-looking, the backward-looking, forward-looking idea of reparatory justice was really intriguing. I mean, the example that might be interesting, though it's from a completely, different context, connected, I think, is in the Canadian context, the response to the residential schools tragedy, where the Royal Commission that followed up on residential schools and the impact on First Nations peoples, which I think, and there are critiques of it, but does have a backward-looking, forward-looking notion of of corrective and distributive justice. So that might be an analogy that might be, and there are connections there to health as well, that might be worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question from Mary, a follow-up on care. The impact on care homes and carers who help in homes during COVID. This all speaks, I think, Mary's voice now. This all speaks, I think, to the challenges but importance of doing work which expands the ambit of how we have thought of health law, and race has been so erased within the discipline of health law, which I think is a really interesting point about kind of the whiteness of health law, I guess.
Yeah, I think we've been very interested. In expanding, or our generation of scholars, I think, has been very interested in expanding the different bodies of healthcare, and the different body parts. But I'm not sure we've fully done justice to the racialized body at all, or the raced body at all. I think that's there's work to be done, most definitely.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that exhausts our questions, Michael. You're probably exhausted now from a long day, probably swimming and whatever it is you do. And so it just leaves me to thank you for joining us today and presenting an incredibly rich, thought-provoking paper. It's an ideal paper for us at the Institute. It connects to many of the themes that we're looking at and focused on within the School of Advanced Study around decolonization, inequality. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank you as well, our audience, for joining us and for participating. Our next seminar in the Directors Series will be on the 24th of February at 1600 GMT. And I hope you'll join me then. But until then, thank you, Michael. Thank you to our audience. It's goodbye from me from the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.